The questions that most interest me, and that I hope will most interest you, are not the ones so much about what we do tomorrow about the drug problem. I should say in the United States, much of the work of my organization, the Drug Policy Alliance, are in fact focused on those issues. We're deeply involved in lobbying and advocating for things like legal access to sterile syringes, which we still have to fight for in the United States, and for the legalization and regulation of medical marijuana, and for reducing overdose fatalities, and for rolling back harsh criminal sentences on nonviolent drug offenses, and things like that. But the questions I want to talk about here today are the bigger ones, the bigger picture ones. And it really is to take this as an opportunity to reflect on what has been literally a century of building up what might best be called a global drug prohibition regime. Right? An international regime consisting of international conventions and national laws and local laws and all sorts of norms and procedures and international agencies and bilateral and multilateral relationships, all that are part and parcel of a global drug control system that relies primarily, at least in dealing with certain drugs, on prohibitionist approaches, on a policy of punitive prohibition. And by that I mean that in dealing with certain drugs, right? Not alcohol, not tobacco, not the caffeinated beverages, to some extent not really the pharmaceuticals, but these other drugs, cannabis and cocaine and heroin and amphetamine and some things like that, that in dealing with those drugs, criminalization in the criminal justice system must be front and center. That the vast majority of the resources of government in dealing with these issues must go to law enforcement, or in some cases military, to punitive approaches to criminal justice. That in my country, if we're going to have a drug czar, it's going to be a former police chief, a former military general, or perhaps a professional moralist. That's the assumption that underlies the global war on drugs. Now, I would also say there's an element of this global war on drugs, this system of punitive prohibition, which has been a bit more like a crusade than like a public policy. You know, I mean, one thing that distinguishes, when you think about sensible, reasonable public policies, when you want to idealize it, you say, well, you look at the costs and the benefits of various policy options. We look at all the various options. Let's deal with environmental challenges. Let's deal with immigration challenges. Let's deal with national security challenges. Let's deal with healthcare here. What are the great variety of options? Those which are most politically acceptable, those which are less politically acceptable. Let's assess costs and benefits, likely outcomes. Let's go through the game plan. Let's go all of this sort of stuff, right? And then hopefully we develop some sort of consensus, and maybe we can develop the political will to implement those sorts of things, right? And there's a sense of some element of fiscal accountability or responsibility behind all of this as well. One would never describe drug control policy in that way. Never. There is not a tradition of real cost-benefit analysis in looking at various drug control options in your country, in my country, or in most other countries or at the global level around the world. It is more in the notion of a crusade, right? And part of the notion of a crusade is when you send the soldiers off to take Jerusalem, you don't worry if they come back. You don't worry about the overall cost of those things. You are willing to pay any price and bear any burden to accomplish the ultimate objective. And the notion of even introducing a cost-benefit assessment, of looking at the unintended consequences of your policies, your interventions, is regarded as inappropriate because it is a crusade. Now, part of the evidence of this crusade is the absence of this cost-benefit analysis. Part of the other evidence of the crusade is to just look at what happened in 1998. Every 10 years, the United Nations has a UNGAS, UN General Assembly Special Session on Drug Control. And they did one in New York in 1998. And UNGAS, the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, or whatever it was called back then, puts out its statements. What is it? A drug-free world. We can do it. It sort of makes you wonder, what were they smoking at the time, right? I mean, a drug-free world, we can do it? Based upon what? Has there ever been a drug-free society in the history of human civilization? I mean, maybe the Eskimos, because they couldn't grow anything. But I mean, apart from them, quite frankly, virtually every society around the world, including some of the most primitive, have somehow figured out how to devise, how to uncover various plants, substances, barks, you name it, that will alter one state of consciousness, right? This was one of the things that came through in the book by Andrew Weil, The Natural Mind, written 40 years ago, a real classic about this, where he speculated about human beings' sort of need to alter the state of consciousness is almost an essential human drive. And that although we didn't need plants and chemicals to alter this state of our state of consciousness, it was remarkable the extent to which virtually all societies, figured out various plants, chemicals, substances with which to enhance, to enable the alteration of consciousness. Remarkable the way societies all around the world, oftentimes with no contact with one another, figured out when that piece of fruit or that piece of something, you let it marinate and drink it, and that was booze. Booze was discovered independently all around the world by people without very much training in distilleries, right? Hunter-gatherer tribes, looking at, mushrooms and fungus and barks, and that one was nutritious, and that one would kill you, and that one, well, you'd find God, right? This has been the nature over the years. And so the notion of a drug-free society is, of course, not just ahistorical, but also absurd, right? Now, why would a scientific agency like the U.S. National Institute on Drug Abuse put as its slogan, achieving a drug-free society? Why would the United Nations do this, right? Now, on some level, they acknowledge we're not really going to create a drug-free society. And on some level, they acknowledge that alcohol and cigarettes and pharmaceuticals are drugs too. But the part of the response then becomes, well, but don't you agree that at least we should try to come that much closer to becoming a drug-free society? Shouldn't we aspire to reduce the levels of psychoactive drugs, at least those drugs, and maybe those drugs, down to some level to get closer, asymptotically closer to being a drug-free society? And my basic argument, my basic response to that is, no, not really. Because when you set out that as your objective, when you say, we will do anything, we will pay any price and bear any burden to try to get that much closer to being a drug-free society, it is when you have the crusade. It is when you will spend billions and then tens of billions of dollars. It is when you will ignore the unintended consequences of the policies that you've embraced, that you've adopted. It is when you ignore the things that need to be paid attention to. And it also, I think, is the wrong question. It is the wrong question or the wrong challenge. That the real challenge, I don't think, is to reduce the number of people or the amount of the drugs being consumed, legally or illegally. I don't think that's the most important challenge. It's a reasonable challenge. It's a legitimate objective. But it seems to me the best objective, the best way to define the objective of drug control policy in your country, mine, in any country or globally, is that drug policy which succeeds in accomplishing two objectives. First, to reduce the negative consequences of drug use. To reduce the addiction, the disease, the death, the crime, the suffering associated with the use and misuse of various drugs. To reduce HIV and hepatitis C, to reduce overdose fatalities, to reduce cirrhosis and the cancers and all of the other negative consequences of drugs, the asocial behavior, the violent behavior associated with alcohol and some stimulant drugs. To reduce all of that as much as possible. And then there's the second objective. The second objective is to reduce as much as possible the negative consequences of our drug control policies. To reduce the expense focused on incarceration and arrest. To reduce the crime and violence and corruption. To reduce the black markets. To reduce the violations of civil liberties and human rights. Right? To reduce all of that. And so therefore the ultimate, the best drug policy is the one which achieves some mix, that correct balance between reducing the harms of drugs and reducing the harms of our drug control policies. It means making those trade-offs between how many more people do you want to arrest and incarcerate and spend money on in order to reduce the number of people using that drug by 2 or 3%, or vice versa, or what risks are you willing to take. That's the calculus. It also means that when we're asking where government, where media, where public should be debating these issues, envision drug policy is arrayed along a spectrum. From at one hand, the most punitive, Singapore-like, Asia-like, America-like, lock 'em up, zero tolerance, long sentences, drug testing, coercion, you name it approach. And at the other end, what might be called the free market. Milton Friedman's dream, the supermarket model with no controls except maybe access to kids, right? Imagine that spectrum. Now, most of the debate, and oftentimes the only tolerated debate, happens over here. It's in this end of the spectrum where we debate various law enforcement approaches, various interdiction approaches, whatever that might be, right? I believe, and I think, in fact, I'm fairly confident that the science and the evidence and the close reading of the history and what have you says that the really valuable debate is the one that happens here. That the ones offering the most interesting ideas to come up with the best drug policy, what might be called the sweet spot where you most effectively reduce the harms of drugs and the harms of our policies, is the debate that's going to happen between the people who support legalization and regulation of drugs, between the libertarians or the people who believe in a legal regulatory approach, and those who aren't comfortable with legalization, who are what might be called the prohibitionist harm reduction folks, or the harm reductionizing prohibitionist folks. It's the ones who believe in harm reduction, who believe in dealing with drugs as an issue of health and human rights, who want to reduce the harms of drugs, who want to roll back the harshness, who want to empower public health authorities, but obviously don't want the harshness of the drug war, but don't feel comfortable going over to the legalization area. That, I believe, to the extent that the public debate can be shifted over there, that is where the way forward is going to lie in the 21st century. If the 20th century was all about agglomerating and building up a global punitive prohibitionist system, the 21st century, ideally, and I think there's evidence that suggests it's heading this direction, will be about thinking through how we shift from a global drug prohibition regime to some form of global drug control, drug regulatory regime, one that reduces the harms of drugs and reduces the harms of the policies. Now, I remember when I first started getting involved in this, and my background had, when I was first getting involved and writing a dissertation and books on the internationalization of crime control, and I briefly worked in the U.S. State Department's Narcotics Bureau, wrote a classified report on drug-related money laundering. I interviewed drug enforcement agents around the world. I got to know the people involved on that side of things. And then I started speaking out and saying the broader approach is not working. But I remember going to meetings in the U.S. and Latin America, and Council on Foreign Relations, the Inter-American Dialogue, a range of distinguished organizations, the Lowy Institute equivalents in the US and Latin America. And the same thing would happen at these meetings. I would call it the tale of two dialogues. We'd sit around, and these would be distinguished people, maybe some from government, some from outside government, academics, and we talk about, especially the US Latin American ones, well, we all agree. We need to reduce the supply of drugs, right, through a combination of carrots and sticks, right? The old carrots and sticks. Let's crack down on illegal opium and coca and cannabis cultivation. Let's provide incentives for the farmers to move in something else. And meanwhile, we need to reduce the demand in the consumer countries, and of course, let's respect one another's sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we'd all break and go have our dinner, or pisco sours, or whatever the drink we were in, whatever country we were in, and then you have the real conversation. And 1/3 of the people would say, you know something, this is all ridiculous. We should just legalize the stuff. And another 1/3 of the people would say, you're probably right, but it's never going to happen, so why even talk about it? And the last 1/3 would say, I can't believe you want to give drugs to my children. End of conversation. Go back the next day, and we would have the same kind of circle around the table: reduce supply, reduce demand, blah, 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 right? Setting fictional goals and all this sort of stuff. Well, That was where the debate was stalled forever and ever. Latin American leaders, would privately say one thing and publicly, have to go along with the U.S. war on drugs strategy. The U.S. my government very forceful in building up this global regime, pushing very hard through our bilateral, multilateral relations through the OAS and the United Nations, through our Drug Enforcement Administration, being the first and largest global police agency in world history, pushing through our State Department, all of the ways in which we did this sort of stuff. And the Latin American leaders were stuck between a rock and a hard place, between, on the one hand, seeing that here was a global commodities market, like most other global commodities markets, like coffee, like sugar, like alcohol, like cigarettes, like precious metals. That if there was a demand, there was going to be a supply. That if you cracked down on the supply for one reason, it was going to pop up somewhere else. That just as bad weather might knock out one source, another source would emerge. If there's a demand, there will be a supply. They saw that. On the other hand, they realized that anything they said that acknowledged the fact that this was a vibrant global commodities market for which a prohibitionist approach could not succeed, and that the principal impact of the prohibitionist approach was simply to elevate the cost and the value of the commodity dramatically through criminalization, and to shift it from the hands of legitimate, tax-paying multinational or local national corporations into the hands of other types of organizations that were expert in the uses of violence and extortion. Even though they could see all that, they knew that to say that out loud was to risk incurring the wrath of the United States government and the U.S. Congress and the UN drug control agencies. But something's beginning to change. Something's beginning to change, and it's bubbling up all around the world. It really is. And let me just talk about this from the four parts of the world. Europe was the first to begin to wise up. Europe, and I should say Australia. I mean, you were the guys who, and Alex is really quite a national, should be a national hero in this respect, Alex Wodak, who realized about the spread of HIV and injecting drug use early in the 1980s, who instituted needle exchange programs and other harm reduction mechanisms early on, who succeeded in keeping the Australian rate of HIV among injecting drug users at less than 2%, who provided a model not just for the Netherlands, but for Margaret Thatcher's conservative government to embrace harm reduction, while my country fuddled and duddled and said this was God's judgment and allowed roughly 250,000 people to die unnecessarily because we didn't have the courage or leadership to institute the sorts of programs that you instituted here very pragmatically, right? But Australia showed some leadership there. The Netherlands showed some leadership on harm reduction policies, acknowledging the reality that drugs are here to stay, that we have to learn how to live with them, and we need to reduce the harms associated. They innovated with the coffee shop system, the cannabis distribution system. Basically, coffee shops buy marijuana. Some of them are actually run by city councils. Rates of marijuana use are still half or less than what they are in the United States. Rates of marijuana use have gone up and down in Europe, more or less like they have in other European countries with harsher policies. Almost no criminality associated with it, except at the wholesale level, which was never legalized. Then the Swiss took the leadership. Well, actually, you Australians took the leadership on the notion of saying with hardcore heroin addicts, let them go to a clinic, let them get pharmaceutical heroin. That just might work. You had a researcher, Gabriel Bammer, published more papers than anybody on this stuff. I thought Australia was going to be first, out of the block on this. But your former Prime Minister, John Howard, I think, said that would send the wrong message. I've never quite understood how doing a research study sends the wrong message, but nonetheless, he said it would send the wrong message. So the Swiss took the leadership, and then the Germans, and the Dutch, and then the Canadians, and the British, and the Spanish, all saying, let's do it, doing the program, allowing heroin addicts who could not quit through methadone or drug-free programs to come and get this, proving that this helped reduce addiction, disease, crime, proving that this saved taxpayers money, proving that people who got into these programs would in fact sometimes seek to become abstinent because finally they were no longer chasing the holy grail of heroin and they decided that now is the moment to stop. So Europe showed the leadership in beginning to move in a new direction, and European governments began to organize themselves in the international organizations to represent a harm reduction front. Then secondly, Asia, which has always been so punitive, and they still got the death penalty, and you go there, death for whatever they call drugs there, for heroin and too much marijuana, but they're freaked out about AIDS. They're freaked out about AIDS. They can see what lies around the corner. They see the possibility that HIV could spread in parts of Asia through injecting drug users and related sexual activity the way that it spread through heterosexual activity in southern Africa. And you have countries like Malaysia and Vietnam and China and Indonesia and Iran actually beginning to establish, sometimes with Australian aid, needle exchange programs and methadone maintenance programs, things that were inconceivable 10 years ago. 6 years ago, the Ayatollah in Iran, who was head of the Ministry of Justice, issued a fatwa declaring that needle exchange and methadone were okay under Sharia law. Iran has the highest heroin addiction rate in the world. They realized there needed to be an element of pragmatism. So even in Asia, what you begin to see is the beginnings of some movement in support of harm reduction. China, with their historical trauma around the opium wars, nonetheless standing up, leaders of the health ministry, and saying, we want 500,000 people in China on methadone maintenance in the next 5 or 10 years, and beginning to institute needle exchange, combining it still with highly punitive policies, but there's an opening of sorts. Thirdly, Latin America. Latin America, I mean, something quite significant is happening there, and it goes to the ways in which this issue crosses left and right, where you can't predict, who's going to be supporting this issue, who's going to be against you on this issue, and where sometimes the libertarians and others, join with the people on the left liberal side, left liberal, what I'm talking about, in terms of innovative new policies. 2 years ago, 3 distinguished former presidents, Cardoso of Brazil, Gaviria of Colombia, and Zedillo of Mexico, formed a Latin American Commission on Drugs and Democracy. They enlisted 16 other former government ministers, the publishers of major media enterprises, El Tiempo in Colombia, El Globo in Brazil, and Reforma in Mexico. And they issued a really path-breaking report. They didn't call for legalization. In fact, they didn't even use the word legalization, although quite a number of the members, in fact, would have advocated for legalization. But they did 4 things that were very significant. Unlike all other high-level expert commissions in the past, this one used the phrase drug prohibition. They said the world's drug problems are not just about the misuse of drugs, they are also about the failures and consequences and costs of our prohibitionist policies. That the crime and the violence and the corruption and the black markets and all of this are the results of a prohibitionist approach. That to some extent, the analogy to alcohol prohibition and Al Capone and all that is a legitimate analogy. That when we look at this, what does the UN estimate? Between $200 and $400 billion a year of black market revenue from the drug business, empowering organized and unorganized criminals, apolitical and political terrorists and criminals, right? They identified prohibition as a major part of the problem, and they used the language of prohibition. Secondly, they said Latin America can learn from the experiences of harm reduction in Europe, Australia, and elsewhere. Thirdly, they said cannabis should be decriminalized, and they were vague about whether they meant just decriminalize possession or whether we should actually legally regulate it like alcohol. And finally, they said the time has come to break the taboo, an open and honest dialogue of all drug policy options. It's hard to overemphasize the significance of breaking the taboo. When I have talked to former heads of the Pentagon, former heads of policy planning in the State Department in my country and in comparable ministries in other countries, you know what comes across? People, the smartest, most thoughtful people in government, the ones working in offices of net assessment, policy planning, or whatever, are never tasked or asked, allowed to ask about the whole array of policy options that lie over here. They're never asked the question, if you crack down on drug production in this country, where will it pop up instead? Those questions are not permitted, not allowed. Essentially, government, and all the people funded by government, including researchers, develop political blinders that teach them not to ask the inconvenient questions that might lead to inconvenient answers that might be exposed and embarrass people no matter how intellectually solid they are. And that then those political blinders become intellectual blinders and people cease to think more broadly. That Latin American Commission has had an impact. You know, when I look in the last 3 months, President Calderon of Mexico is saying, okay, I think maybe we finally need a debate about legalization. I'm not for it, he's saying. And then President Fox, his predecessor, says that's the only way to go. And Jorge Castaneda, the former foreign minister, is saying that's the way to go. And now I will tell you this, and this is not fully public information as yet, but there will be a sequel to this commission. There will be a global drug policy commission composed of people not just from Latin America, but from other parts of the world, people of great distinction in my country and in Europe and elsewhere, who will be coming out, I believe, sometime in 2011 with a report that will, I believe, begin to open up the broader debate. So finally, I have to come back to my own country, and then I will conclude and take questions and such. Things are changing in the United States, even if the election results a few weeks ago has definitely given me some pause, more than pause, a lot more than pause. But the fact of the matter is, on drug control policy, Obama, and at least the Democratic Congress that is still in power for now, did point in a new direction. That the U.S. began to acknowledge the need for harm reduction in global drug policy, even if they remain reluctant to use that language. They finally reversed their opposition to needle exchange. There became a greater willingness to open up to science-based policies. Last year, for the first year in 100 years, my government was no longer the leading champion of the global war on drugs. We've handed off the baton to the Russians. The Russians, you know, are gamma with this. The Russians have a policy with respect to Afghanistan. They want to do to Afghanistan with respect to drugs, more or less, I think, what they did to Afghanistan when they occupied it before we were there, right? Look how successful that was. But the notion was that if you try to burn down the entire place, maybe that'll help solve the problem. But no evidence, no hard evidence that that might actually work in terms of accomplishing the old broader objectives of dealing with heroin addiction around the world. So there is some shift in the U.S. What's happening most fascinatingly around marijuana, I mean, obviously with our horrific state budget deficits, there's finally the movement to look for alternatives to incarceration. Last year was the first year in 30 years where our state prison population actually fell slightly. But with marijuana, there's this bizarre possibility that the United States is going to leapfrog the Dutch when it comes to legally regulating marijuana. If you ask where in the world is marijuana now sold most openly and legally outside the Netherlands, the answer is in the 14 or 15 states where medical marijuana is now legal. Right? Hundreds of thousands of people able to go to above ground, locally regulated shops and buy these products. Public opinion support for legalizing marijuana has jumped dramatically from 36% just 5 years ago to 46% today. It's 58% among people out west. It's 70-something% among liberals. It's 65% among people between the age of 18 and 25. It's 50-50 or a little better among independents. It's 55% among Democrats. There's a gender gap there with men more in favor than women. But the fact of the matter is that when Proposition 19 in California got 46.3% of the vote a few weeks ago, which was dramatically more than Meg Whitman, who spent $160 million, got in her race for governor, or that Carly Fiorina, who spent $50 million or whatever, got in her race for senator. That blew me away. I had no idea that it could do that well. That the loss on election day was a blip compared to the transformation, compared to the elevation and legitimization of the dialogue around marijuana in the United States. I can guarantee you, because I do play a very significant role in some of this stuff, that in 2012, there will almost certainly be new initiatives on the ballot in California and other Western states to try to legally regulate marijuana markets. And there will be more in 2016. And some of these will begin to win. And Congress will be the last place to change. But the states as laboratories for democracy, there is a transformation beginning to happen. Now, does that mean that when a global commission comes out and says we need a shift in the paradigm of drug control policy, that the U.S. will respond? The Obama administration will need to make its own calculus, right? The drug czar, Kolakowski, his name is in the United States, has so far refused to entertain any debate. And it's embarrassing, the sort of weakness of the arguments that are offered against any honest and vigorous debate. But if you put all this together, what you see Europe keeps moving forward in some ways. Now it's Portugal with its policy of decriminalizing drug possession, which seems to be remarkably successful, in an important article out just this week in the British Journal of Criminology. It's Asia struggling its way to deal with HIV. It's Latin America where at the level of elites, there's this growing consensus that not just the drug war, but the whole prohibitionist paradigm needs to be reassessed. There's America with a different guy in the White House. There's a transformation happening in the culture around the marijuana issue. Meanwhile, nobody knows what to do about Afghanistan. I mean, what, 90%, was it over 50% of the GDP coming from the illegal opium trade? No, what's the answer in Mexico? Right, with its horrific levels of violence and organized crime and intimidation, and can the Plan Colombia strategy work there or not? Ask me that question later, we can discuss it, right? But the fact of the matter, with a quarter of all the people incarcerated around the world being there for drug law violations, with the war on drugs being the basis for violating human rights in societies all around the world, I realize we're not here talking about climate change and maybe the world coming to an end. And we're not talking about nuclear proliferation that may extinguish the lives of millions of people in a day. But we are talking about policies that I would best describe as a cancer on the global politic over the last century. About this sort of bringing into the 20th century and the 21st century a sort of relic of old, almost quasi-religious notions about dealing with something that has survived into a more enlightened era. The costs have now amounted to at least $1 trillion in the United States since President Nixon declared war on drugs 40 years ago. The negative consequences are going to continue to pop up one way or another until we acknowledge that we're dealing with a global commodities market, until we acknowledge that prohibition does not represent the ultimate form of regulation, that prohibition represents the abdication of regulation, that we need to move into a new debate, a new paradigm in which drug control policies are grounded in science, compassion, in health, and human rights. Thank you very much.